two sisters born together, raised together, and locked in a world that no one else could enter. They spoke in a language only they understood, shut out their family, their teachers, and eventually the whole world. To outsiders they were silent, but inside their bubble they plotted stories, created entire universes, and, in the end, made a chilling pact. One of them had to die so the other could live. Before we begin this journey into the haunting story of the Silent Twins, let me know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. In April 1963, in the county town of Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire, Wales, twin girls were born to Caribbean immigrants Gloria and Aubrey Gibbons. They were named June Allison and Jennifer Lorraine. The Gibbons family had come to Britain during the post-war years when the government encouraged immigration from Commonwealth nations to rebuild the labor force. Like many other arrivals of that period, their experience was one of resilience and struggle, navigating both opportunity and prejudice in a society where visible minorities were still rare. The twins entered the world healthy, but their development soon showed signs of difference. The Gibbons family eventually grew to 5 children, yet June and Jennifer, the middle daughters, stood apart. From their earliest days, they seemed to exist in a world that excluded even their parents and siblings. Their bond was unusually intense, the kind of closeness that can develop between twins, magnified tenfold. Their father, Aubrey, worked as a technician for the Royal Air Force, a stable but demanding job that involved frequent moves for the family. Their mother, Gloria, managed the household and cared for the children. In these formative years, the twins were described as bright but strangely withdrawn. They displayed an early tendency to ignore outsiders and to retreat into their own company. By the time they began to speak, it became clear they were not using language in the ordinary way. Family members noticed that June and Jennifer communicated primarily with each other, using a rapid-fire, high-pitched language that was unintelligible to others. This was later identified as an example of idioglossia, a private language unique to a pair of twins. Linguists would eventually note that theirs was based partly on Bajan Creole, the dialect spoken by their Barbadian parents, but warped into something private and accelerated, so that even their own family could not follow. This unusual mode of speech meant that in their home, as in the wider world, the twins were isolated. They spoke little to their siblings. They rarely addressed their parents. They lived, from the very beginning, in a dyad that seemed impenetrable. As their father's RAF postings moved the family from one part of Britain to another, the twins experienced the dislocation common to military children. But for June and Jennifer, these shifts deepened their retreat into each other. By the time they reached school age, they had become markedly silent outside the home. Teachers described them as non-participatory, staring at their desks, and refusing to engage. There was another factor shaping their silence: racism. In the Pembrokeshire community where they spent their early years, the Gibbons children were among the very few black children. Classmates mocked them, excluded them, and sometimes physically bullied them. Their differences became a source of ridicule, reinforcing their reluctance to communicate. Silence became a form of protection. They were together against the world, and they decided that no one else would be let in. This was not a case of complete mutism. At home, when no strangers were present, June and Jennifer could be heard speaking rapidly to one another in their invented tongue. They could be lively and expressive with each other. But when outsiders entered the space, teachers, neighbors, even extended family, they would freeze. Their silence was selective, but rigid. From early on, observers noticed that the twins did everything in synchrony. They walked with identical steps, often mirroring one another's posture and gestures. They ate together, moved together, even seemed to breathe in tandem. This pattern would persist into adulthood, baffling teachers, doctors, and eventually psychiatrists. Their younger sister, Rosie, later recalled that the family grew accustomed to the strange pair. But even within their own household, the twins were often regarded as distant, locked in a private universe. Their parents, both practical and hardworking, were concerned but also overwhelmed with the demands of raising 5 children. For them, the twins' strangeness was an enigma, not easily solved, and life went on around it. By the late 1960s, as the twins entered adolescence, Their private world had hardened into a near-exclusive bond. To the outside world, they were shy, mute girls who failed to thrive socially. But inside their hidden conversations, they were developing imaginations, stories, and shared plans that no one else could penetrate. The foundations of their later struggles were being laid in these years. The habit of exclusion, the pattern of mutism, the bond of dependence. Already, there were signs that their unique connection was both a refuge and a prison. What began as childhood eccentricity was solidifying into something more permanent, something that would eventually alarm professionals, bewilder their family, and shape the course of both of their lives. When June and Jennifer entered the school system, the difficulties that had shadowed their early childhood became sharper and harder to disguise. At home, their parents knew that the girls communicated freely with one another in their strange rapid tongue. But at school they became almost entirely mute. Teachers who encountered them described the experience as unsettling. The girls sat in silence, their heads down, speaking neither to staff nor to classmates. Their refusal was not one of defiance in the usual sense, but rather of withdrawal, as though a curtain had been drawn between them and the outside world. The silence was compounded by the environment in which they were placed. Haverfordwest in the 1970s was a predominantly white community. For June and Jennifer, the only black children in their classes, the isolation was not only linguistic but racial. Their skin color marked them out in a place where difference was noted instantly. Accounts from peers and teachers record that the twins were often teased, ostracized, and sometimes physically harassed. The result was predictable. They withdrew further, leaning on each other more heavily for companionship and emotional survival. Attempts were made to draw them out. Speech therapists and teachers worked with them, encouraging them to respond, to practice social communication, to participate in lessons. The twins sometimes complied minimally, writing a few words or uttering brief responses when absolutely necessary, but their silence always returned. More than once, school authorities reported their behavior to psychologists, concerned that their refusal to speak signaled a deeper disorder. Examinations concluded that they were of normal intelligence, not developmentally impaired, but suffering from an extreme form of elective mutism. At home, their family tried to push them to speak with mixed success. Their mother, Gloria, expressed frustration at their unwillingness to communicate with others, even while recognizing that they could be lively and creative with each other in private. Their father, Aubrey, was a more reserved figure, and the responsibility of raising 5 children while moving often for RAF postings meant that the twins' silence remained an unsolved problem in the household. As they grew into adolescence, their behavior took on more ritualistic qualities. Observers noted the way they mirrored each other in every detail. They walked together, often at an identical pace, their heads slightly bent forward. If one moved her hand, the other followed almost instantly. The effect was unnerving to outsiders, reinforcing the sense that they were bound by an invisible thread. Even within the family, siblings described them as living in a bubble that excluded everyone else. School authorities attempted to separate them, reasoning that if they were forced to function individually, they might learn to communicate more normally. For a time, they were placed in different boarding schools. The results were catastrophic. Separated from her sister, each girl became nearly catatonic. They refused to eat, to move, or to speak. Teachers described them as statues, immobile and unreachable. Far from breaking their dependence, the separation intensified it, demonstrating to all involved that their connection was not merely close but pathological. When reunited, they seemed to rebound instantly, speaking once more in their private language and resuming their mirrored routines. Professionals began to realize that the twins' condition could not be addressed by force. The connection was too strong, their mutual dependence too deeply rooted. Despite their silence in the classroom, the twins' inner world was rich and active. They developed a fascination with storytelling, spending long hours together writing elaborate plays and short stories. They crafted detailed narratives about imaginary families and scenarios, inventing complex characters and events. Writing became their primary outlet, the one way in which their imaginations could be expressed beyond speech. This creativity would later grow into a driving passion, leading them to produce entire novels in their teenage years. But even here, their output was closed to outsiders, shared only with one another. The 1970s passed in this strange pattern of silence and expression. The twins remained isolated from the social world around them, their lives dominated by their bond, their rituals, and their secret language. To their teachers and peers, they were the silent girls in the corner, inscrutable and unreachable. To each other, they were companions, collaborators, and mirrors. The lines between individuality and shared identity were beginning to blur, and as they moved toward adulthood, the pressures of that bond would begin to turn darker. As adolescence gave way to young adulthood, June and Jennifer carried their silence with them, but their energies began to shift. The world outside had always been hostile and unwelcoming, and now they started to respond in ways that were more openly rebellious. Their creative writing had already revealed an appetite for drama and danger. They wrote stories filled with characters who committed violent acts or engaged in daring escapades. Increasingly, they sought to act out some of those impulses in the real world. The Gibbons twins had long been seen as oddities in their community, standing apart and walking in rigid synchrony. In their teenage years, their behavior became more visibly troubling. They were often seen standing silently together for hours, watching the movements of neighbors or staring through windows. Their parents worried but struggled to reach them, and professionals had few answers. The twins' diaries, kept meticulously through these years, revealed an escalating conflict between love and resentment, dependence and rivalry. Both longed to separate, yet neither could imagine existing without the other. That tension spilled outward, and the wider community began to feel its effects. The first steps into delinquency were small. The girls engaged in petty thefts, shoplifting from local stores. They vandalized property, breaking windows and scratching doors. At first, these incidents seemed like the ordinary misbehavior of restless teenagers. But with the twins, the acts carried a strange edge. They always worked together, silent and synchronized, as though crime had become another form of their shared ritual. As their impulses escalated, the crimes grew more serious. They broke into buildings, stole goods, and engaged in acts of arson. Fires became a particular fascination. On several occasions, they set fire to unoccupied buildings, watching as the flames took hold. For them, the destruction seemed to carry a symbolic weight, an assertion of power in a world where they felt powerless. In their diaries, they wrote about the thrill of fire and the release it gave them. For the authorities, it was a clear danger. In 1981, after a series of escalating incidents, June and Jennifer were arrested. The charges included vandalism, burglary, and arson. In court, their silence baffled the proceedings. They refused to speak, staring at the ground or at each other. The image of the identical young women, tall and silent, accused of serious crimes, struck many observers as eerie. The legal system struggled to process them, caught between the categories of criminal and psychiatric case. Ordinarily, crimes of this kind might have resulted in a prison sentence of a few years. But the presiding judge, influenced by psychiatric evaluations, concluded that the twins posed a danger not only to society but to themselves. Instead of prison, they were committed under the Mental Health Act to indefinite detention at Broadmoor Hospital, the most secure psychiatric facility in Britain. The decision was controversial. Broadmoor was known for housing some of the country's most violent offenders, including serial killers and notorious gangsters. For two young women whose crimes, though serious, had not harmed anyone physically, the placement seemed extreme. Yet the court accepted the psychiatrist's argument that their silence, dependence, and mental state required the highest level of supervision. The ruling changed the course of their lives. What might have been a short sentence became a confinement with no fixed end. Once inside Broadmoor, their strange relationship and selective mutism would be subjected to the most intense scrutiny they had ever faced. For June and Jennifer, the descent into crime had been an expression of their frustrated bond. The consequence was to lock them away in an institution that would magnify both their dependence and their suffering. In 1982, June and Jennifer Gibbons were admitted to Broadmoor Hospital, Britain's most notorious psychiatric institution. For the twins, still only 19, The transfer marked the beginning of a chapter that would come to define them in the public imagination. They arrived not as violent offenders in the conventional sense, but as young women whose silence and strangeness had bewildered teachers, doctors, and judges. Yet the crimes of arson and burglary had pushed them into the orbit of a system designed for society's most dangerous figures. Broadmoor was not an ordinary hospital. Founded in the mid-19th century, it had a long history of housing individuals deemed criminally insane. By the early 1980s, its wards contained some of the most infamous names in Britain: serial killers, murderers, and violent offenders whose actions had shocked the public. The secure perimeter, the locked wards, the constant surveillance all reflected the gravity of those inside. For the Gibbons twins, whose offenses had destroyed property but harmed no one, the placement seemed grossly disproportionate. The first impressions of Broadmoor were overwhelming. The institution was vast, cold, and intimidating. New arrivals were stripped of their clothes, issued hospital garments, and subjected to the same routines of medication and observation as hardened criminals. The twins, already intensely shy and withdrawn, retreated even further into themselves. Their selective mutism became absolute silence. Among strangers and authority figures, they rarely moved their lips, and when they did, words were scarce. Doctors and staff were both fascinated and frustrated by them. Psychiatric notes from the time described two young women of normal intelligence, clearly capable of communication, who nonetheless refused to participate in group therapy, education, or ordinary conversation. They would sometimes laugh or mutter in their private language when alone, but in the presence of others they sat motionless, their eyes cast downward. Nurses reported that they walked in synchrony down the corridors, moving in mirror image, as though bound by invisible strings. Other patients found them unnerving. Broadmoor was already a place of tension and volatility, and the silent presence of two tall, identical young women who spoke to no one but each other added to its peculiar atmosphere. Some of the men housed there, infamous figures in Britain's criminal history, attempted to speak to them or provoke them, but the twins offered no response. Their refusal to engage made them both targets of curiosity and subjects of fear. The staff tried various approaches. Psychiatrists prescribed heavy antipsychotic medications, including drugs that left the twins drowsy and sluggish. These treatments produced little change in their silence, but they did induce significant side effects, including tremors and involuntary movements. Some staff members attempted to separate the girls into different wards, hoping that isolation might force them into independent speech. The results mirrored earlier attempts at separation in their school years. Both became almost catatonic, refusing food and collapsing into despair. Reunited, they revived. Inside Broadmoor, the girls' diaries remained their most powerful outlet. Writing daily, they recorded their thoughts, frustrations, and the oscillating emotions of their relationship. They chronicled the bleakness of institutional life, the constant presence of medication, and the absence of freedom. They also revealed the depth of their love-hate dynamic. Each wrote of jealousy toward the other, of feeling controlled and suffocated, yet of being unable to imagine life apart. To the outside world, news of their detention at Broadmoor attracted attention. Journalists reported on the silent twins, whose refusal to speak had baffled doctors and judges alike. The image of two identical sisters confined in Britain's most infamous psychiatric hospital fascinated and disturbed readers. Questions were raised about whether justice had been served, or whether the twins had become victims of a system ill-suited to their condition. For June and Jennifer themselves, the early years at Broadmoor were marked by confusion, fear, and resignation. They had entered a world designed for violent men, a place of strict control and harsh treatment. Their crimes had brought them there, but their silence kept them there, reinforcing the view that they were profoundly disturbed. Day by day, their bond remained their only constant, the one relationship that neither staff nor system could break. As the months at Broadmoor turned into years, June and Jennifer's lives settled into a grim routine. The hospital was meant to be therapeutic, but for the twins it became another cage, amplifying the very patterns that had led them there. Their refusal to speak outside their secret language persisted. To staff and fellow patients they appeared mute statues, only occasionally exchanging fleeting glances or whispers in a tongue no one else could understand. Their silence became both their shield and their prison. The institution itself imposed strict rules. Days were governed by set meal times, medication rounds, and compulsory therapy sessions. Nurses tried repeatedly to draw the girls into group activities, but they sat stiff and motionless, refusing to participate. When coaxed into one-to-one sessions, their responses were minimal or non-existent. Psychiatrists grew frustrated. One noted in reports that the twins were chronically resistant to treatment and showed little willingness to engage with therapeutic interventions. In the face of this silence, staff experimented with separation, convinced that dependence on one another was the root of the problem. The twins were placed on different wards at intervals, but each time the outcome was disastrous. Left without her sister, each girl retreated into near-total immobility. They refused food, lay rigid in bed, and appeared close to collapse. Reunited, they revived almost instantly, confirming the intensity of their connection. To the staff, it was proof that their lives were intertwined beyond ordinary comprehension. To the twins themselves, it reinforced the terrifying reality that they could not exist apart. Their dependence had its own dark consequences. They mirrored each other's movements with uncanny precision. If one lifted a hand, the other did the same. If one paused mid-step, the other froze. Even nurses accustomed to unusual behavior among psychiatric patients were unsettled by the sight. It was as if each twin's sense of self extended only so far as her sister's presence. Inside their private world, however, their inner lives were far from silent. Through their diaries, the twins documented their conflicting emotions with painful honesty. They wrote of longing for independence, of fantasies about living separate lives, and of a suffocating hatred for one another. At the same time, they described the unbearable loneliness they felt when apart. Each diary revealed the paradox. They were trapped both by their dependence and by their desire to be free of it. Medication became another defining feature of their existence at Broadmoor. Prescribed heavy doses of antipsychotics, they endured the side effects that came with such drugs. Tremors shook their hands, drool sometimes escaped their lips, and their bodies moved with a sluggish heaviness. In time, some of these symptoms developed into tardive dyskinesia, a condition of involuntary facial and body movements that was difficult to control. Far from improving their condition, the drugs deepened their sense of alienation, making them feel like shadows of themselves. Despite the bleakness of their surroundings, the twins' creative impulses endured. They continued to write, filling notebooks with short stories and diary entries. Writing was the one realm in which they retained autonomy, a way to capture their inner voices when their outer ones were silenced. Their prose often blended fantasy and reality, describing characters caught between love and destruction, echoing their own predicament. For the staff, their case remained both puzzling and troubling. They were not violent toward others in the way many of Broadmoor's residents were. Their crimes had been destructive but not homicidal. Yet their inability to engage, their strange rituals, and their profound dependence kept them locked in a place reserved for the most disturbed. Over time, some staff began to see them less as dangerous criminals and more as victims of a system that had nowhere else to put them. Years passed in this suspended state. The twins aged into their 20s within the locked walls of Broadmoor. Their dependence on each other remained absolute, their silence unbroken. They lived in a limbo between treatment and punishment, between individuality and shared identity. Each day repeated the last. Silence, medication, mirrored movements, and writing in their diaries. To the outside world, they were forgotten curiosities. Inside, they were two young women caught in a bond they could neither escape nor fully endure. By the mid-1980s, the Gibbons twins had spent several years inside Broadmoor. The outside world moved on, but inside the walls, June and Jennifer remained locked in the same cycle of silence, dependence, and frustration. Their diaries during this period became more revealing than ever, documenting a volatile and at times frightening relationship. Jennifer, the more dominant of the two, often wrote about her control over June, describing herself as the stronger twin and implying that June existed only in her shadow. June, in her own writings, expressed deep resentment at this dominance. She confided feelings of being manipulated and even enslaved by her sister. Yet, paradoxically, she admitted that she could not live without her. Their bond was both lifeline and prison, a relationship of mutual love and destruction. The theme of death began to appear more explicitly in their writing. Each twin fantasized about what life might be like if the other were gone. June wrote of yearning for freedom, imagining a world where she could speak, move, and live independently without Jennifer by her side. Jennifer, in turn, acknowledged her own oppressive role but also expressed fear of being abandoned. Their diaries revealed a dark logic forming between them. Perhaps only one of them could truly live. This idea evolved into what became known as their pact. Accounts from those who later read their writings describe a chilling agreement. One of them would have to die so that the other might be free. The twins themselves wrote about this with clarity and a kind of resignation. Jennifer in particular hinted that she would be the one to make the sacrifice, suggesting that her death was necessary for June to find independence. Despite these writings, outwardly their routines continued much the same. They walked the corridors in silence, mirrored each other's movements, and resisted all attempts at conventional therapy. But within their private world, the idea of the pact hung heavily. Nurses occasionally sensed an intensity in their interactions, moments when one appeared to exert a strange control over the other. Observers described a quality of menace that passed silently between them, though no physical violence was ever recorded. The outside world had not entirely forgotten them. In the 1980s, journalist Marjorie Wallace took an interest in their story after reading about them in the press. Unlike many professionals before her, Wallace approached the twins with patience and persistence. Over time, she gained their trust, reading their diaries and speaking with them in rare moments when they allowed themselves to respond. Her observations confirmed the disturbing nature of their bond. The twins were not simply silent, but trapped in a destructive dynamic where identity and autonomy were constantly at stake. It was Wallace who first revealed the existence of their pact to the public. Through her later writings and interviews, she shared that the twins had reached an unspoken agreement. One must die so the other could live. This revelation shocked readers, adding a new dimension to their already strange story. They were no longer just the silent twins, but sisters locked in a life and death struggle for individuality. Inside Broadmoor, the pact shaped their daily lives in ways subtle and profound. Jennifer began to hint more openly, at least in writing, that she would be the one to die. June recorded her own conflicted feelings, torn between dread and relief at the thought of independence. Staff at Broadmoor remained largely unaware of the seriousness of these private writings, interpreting their silence as resistance rather than as the expression of a complex and desperate bargain. For the twins, the pact was not a dramatic gesture but a slow evolution of thought, born out of years of enforced closeness and mirrored identity. It represented both the depth of their love and the extremity of their entrapment. In their view, freedom and individuality could only come at the cost of death. By the early 1990s, June and Jennifer Gibbons had been confined within Broadmoor Hospital for over a decade. They had entered its gates as teenagers in 1982 and now approached their 30s, shaped and scarred by the years of enforced silence, powerful medication, and the suffocating atmosphere of one of Britain's most infamous psychiatric institutions. Their story had drifted in and out of the public eye, but inside Broadmoor the twins remained largely unchanged in their refusal to communicate with others, their mirrored behaviors, and their dependence upon one another. Yet beneath the surface, the dynamics between them had shifted in ways that would have lasting consequences. During these final years in Broadmoor, the twins continued to fill their diaries and notebooks with a level of self-examination rarely seen by psychiatrists. Their writings documented the emotional storm that defined their relationship, an oscillation between love and hatred, dominance and submission, unity and yearning for separation. June's words often captured a tone of despair, confessing that she felt enslaved by her sister's presence. She described Jennifer as a dark force in her life, a figure who dictated her actions, thoughts, and even her very breath. Jennifer, in turn, admitted her role as the dominant twin but also acknowledged her inability to stop. Both women seemed to agree that they were locked in a cycle of destruction from which only death could provide release. Observers who had access to these diaries were struck by the clarity with which the twins articulated their plight. Unlike their outward mutism, their writing revealed deep intelligence, acute self-awareness, and an almost literary grasp of their condition. They were not oblivious to their silence or their dependence. They understood it with painful precision. And yet, knowing the nature of their entrapment did not provide them with a way to break free. Medication remained a central part of their daily existence. Throughout their time in Broadmoor, they had been prescribed heavy doses of antipsychotics, tranquilizers, and other drugs aimed at reducing their mutism and stabilizing their moods. Instead, these treatments left them dulled, lethargic, and physically damaged. Side effects grew worse over time. Both June and Jennifer developed tardive dyskinesia, a condition marked by involuntary movements of the face and limbs, often a permanent consequence of long-term antipsychotic use. Staff observed their tremors and facial tics with concern, but the medications continued, reflecting the prevailing psychiatric approach of the era. Despite their silence in public spaces, the twins' private interactions remained intense. Nurses reported that they often sat together for hours, communicating in their secret, rapid-fire language that no one else could understand. To outsiders, it sounded like gibberish, a blur of syllables spoken so quickly it was almost incomprehensible. But to June and Jennifer, it was the only true language in which they could express themselves. Their communication was so inward-looking that it further reinforced their image as unreachable, even alien, to those around them. Journalist Marjorie Wallace continued her contact with the twins during these years. She had earned their trust gradually, and unlike many professionals, she was able to glimpse the inner workings of their relationship. Wallace described visits where one twin would speak quietly while the other remained silent, only for the roles to reverse in subsequent meetings. She noticed that their bond was not static but dynamic, a constant shifting of dominance and submission. At times June seemed freer, more able to articulate her feelings, while Jennifer receded into silence. At other times, Jennifer exerted a strong, almost oppressive presence, while June withered under her shadow. Wallace's insights into their pact became clearer as well. By the early 1990s, Jennifer had begun to express a resignation about her role. In conversations and writings, she hinted that she was prepared to be the one who would die. She told Wallace and others that it was her destiny, that for June to live freely, she herself must leave. June's writings during the same period reflected both dread and a desperate hope. She longed to be free of the constant mirroring and suffocation but was terrified of the price such freedom might demand. Professionals at Broadmoor had begun to reconsider the twins' placement. The institution had always been a controversial fit for them. Their crimes, arson, burglary, vandalism, had not caused direct harm to people, and yet they had been placed among violent offenders for over a decade. By the early 1990s, psychiatrists acknowledged that they were not dangerous in the same way as many Broadmoor patients. Plans were discussed to transfer them to a less secure facility, Caswell Clinic in Bridgend, Wales, where the environment was less harsh and where treatment might better address their unique needs. The prospect of transfer became a turning point in the twins' story. They had long spoken of being trapped, of yearning for release. A move to a different hospital represented the possibility of change, even if only slightly. Yet their pact hovered over the moment. Jennifer in particular spoke of her sense that she would not survive the transition. She told Wallace and hinted to others that she was destined to die, that her role was to sacrifice herself so that June could finally live as an individual. In their final years at Broadmoor, the twins' relationship had taken on an almost fatalistic tone. Their mirrored lives, their years of silence, their private language, and their shared isolation had brought them to a point where death seemed not like an intrusion but like an inevitable outcome of their bond. For Jennifer, it was a choice she had already made. For June, it was a looming reality she could not stop but would have to endure. As 1993 approached, the arrangements for their transfer were finalized. After more than a decade in Broadmoor, the Gibbons twins would leave its walls behind. For the staff, it was a relief to move them to a facility more suited to their needs. For the twins, it was a moment of reckoning. The pact they had formed years earlier was about to be tested. In March 1993, after 11 years inside Broadmoor, June and Jennifer Gibbons prepared to leave. The decision to transfer them to Caswell Clinic in Bridgend, Wales had been made after repeated evaluations concluded that they no longer posed the kind of threat that warranted detention in Britain's most secure psychiatric facility. For many, the move represented a long overdue correction, a recognition that their crimes had been non-violent and that their treatment required a less punitive environment. For the twins themselves, however, the transfer carried with it a weight of foreboding, particularly for Jennifer. In the weeks leading up to the transfer, Jennifer began speaking of death with a clarity that unsettled those around her. To journalist Marjorie Wallace, who had remained one of the few outsiders they trusted, Jennifer confided that she would soon die. She said it without drama, without visible fear, but with the calm conviction of someone resigned to destiny. "I'm going to have to die," she told Wallace during one of their final meetings at Broadmoor. When Wallace asked why, Jennifer replied that it was something agreed between her and June, that one had to die so the other could live. Wallace, accustomed by now to the intensity of the twins' private world, nonetheless felt deeply shaken by the certainty in Jennifer's voice. On the day of the transfer, March 9, 1993, staff prepared to escort the twins from Broadmoor to Caswell Clinic. They boarded a minibus, accompanied by nurses and guards. At first, everything appeared ordinary. The twins sat side by side, as they always had, quiet and withdrawn. Yet as the journey began, Jennifer appeared unusually lethargic. Her head drooped, and her movements slowed. Staff assumed she was drowsy, perhaps sedated by medication, as had happened often during their years of heavy drug treatment. But as the miles passed, her condition worsened. By the time the minibus reached Caswell Clinic, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Jennifer collapsed on arrival. Staff rushed to her aid, but she was unresponsive. Within minutes, she was pronounced dead. She was only 29 years old. The cause of death, later recorded, was acute myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle. No drugs, toxins, or external injuries were found. The condition is rare and can occur suddenly, sometimes without warning. To medical professionals, it was an unexplained natural death. To those who knew of the twins' pact, it seemed like the fulfillment of Jennifer's prophecy. June's reaction in the immediate aftermath stunned those around her. Rather than collapsing in grief or rage, she appeared calm, almost relieved. She told Wallace and later others, "I'm free at last. I'm liberated. And Jennifer has given up her life for me." For years, June had written of her desire to be free of Jennifer's dominance, of the suffocating hold her sister had on her. Now, with Jennifer gone, she seemed to believe that the pact had been fulfilled and that she could finally begin to live her own life. The events of that day left staff bewildered. Jennifer had shown no outward signs of severe illness. She had not been on unusually high doses of medication, nor had she suffered from any long-standing heart condition. Her sudden collapse during the very journey that was supposed to mark a new chapter in the twins' lives seemed almost impossible to explain. Some of the nurses who had known them for years whispered privately about the strange inevitability of her death, recalling Jennifer's repeated statements that she would have to die. For June, the years that followed bore out her claim of liberation. After Jennifer's death, she began to speak more openly, first in cautious steps and then with greater confidence. She engaged with staff at Caswell Clinic in ways she never had at Broadmoor. She communicated with her family, her siblings, and with Wallace. While she remained shy and reserved, she was no longer bound by the ritual silence that had defined her relationship with Jennifer. It was as if a barrier had been removed, as if her identity could finally emerge without the constant mirroring of her twin. Jennifer was buried in Haverfordwest, Wales, near the family home. Her gravestone reads, "We once were two, we two made one. We no more two, through life be one. Rest in peace." The inscription captures both the unity and the tragedy of their lives, the sense that their existence had always been intertwined, and that even in death, their bond could not be easily untangled. The story of Jennifer's death quickly spread beyond Wales. Newspapers reported on the uncanny circumstances. Two sisters who had spoken only to each other, who had made a pact about death, and then one of them suddenly dying at the precise moment of their release from Broadmoor. Journalists and commentators speculated about psychological explanations, about the possibility of psychosomatic illness, about the sheer power of belief and dependence. Some framed it as evidence of the destructive potential of twinship taken to extremes. Others viewed it as a tragic indictment of a mental health system that had placed two vulnerable young women in Broadmoor for over a decade. Marjorie Wallace, in her later writings, emphasized that Jennifer's death was not simply a medical anomaly, but the climax of years of psychological entanglement. She believed that Jennifer had consciously or unconsciously willed herself to die, carrying out the pact the twins had forged. In Wallace's view, the medical explanation of myocarditis was only part of the story. The deeper truth lay in the twins' own narrative, in their belief that Jennifer's death was necessary for June's survival. For June, life after Jennifer marked the beginning of an entirely new existence. Though she carried the weight of grief, she also experienced a freedom she had never known. Her voice, once locked away, now emerged into the world. She spoke to her family, to professionals, and eventually to journalists and filmmakers who sought to understand the strange and tragic story of the silent twins. Her survival, and her ability to adapt after Jennifer's death, gave weight to the idea that the pact had indeed served its purpose. Jennifer's sudden death during the transfer remains one of the most haunting elements of the twins' story. Officially, it was a natural medical event, an unforeseen tragedy. Unofficially, it has been remembered as the moment when the silent twins pact was sealed, the moment one life ended so that the other could begin anew. After Jennifer's sudden death in March 1993, June Gibbons entered a new and uncharted phase of her life. For nearly 3 decades, she had lived almost entirely in her sister's shadow, bound by silence, ritual, and dependence. With Jennifer gone, the pact they had forged had reached its grim fulfillment. For June, the result was not only grief but also a kind of liberation she had long yearned for in her diaries. In the immediate aftermath of Jennifer's death, June shocked those around her by speaking more freely than ever before. For years, she had refused to address staff, doctors, or even her family directly. Her communication locked behind the secret language she shared only with Jennifer. Now, for the first time, she began to converse openly. Nurses at Caswell Clinic, where she was transferred following Jennifer's death, noted the transformation. Her mutism was not total any longer. She engaged in conversation, expressed her feelings, and participated in activities in a way that had been unthinkable during her Broadmoor years. To her family, the change was equally striking. Gloria and Aubrey Gibbons, her parents, had spent decades bewildered by the silence of their twin daughters. Now, with only June surviving, they were able to connect with her in ways that had long seemed impossible. Her siblings, too, found themselves meeting a sister they had scarcely known. The girl who had once remained mute and withdrawn at family gatherings was now willing to talk, share, and laugh. Journalist Marjorie Wallace remained close to June during this period, documenting her progress and the extraordinary transformation that followed Jennifer's death. Wallace had long believed that the twin silence was not the result of mental deficiency but of an extreme psychological entanglement. Jennifer's death confirmed this belief in her eyes. Without her twin, June was not incapacitated but freed. The pact, so dark in its premise, had been fulfilled, and its outcome was startling. June was able to live. Still, the liberation came with immense emotional cost. June spoke candidly about the grief she felt, about the sense of emptiness left in Jennifer's absence. They had been inseparable for their entire lives, sharing not only a language but also their most intimate thoughts and emotions. Losing Jennifer meant losing part of herself. Yet she also admitted that her death had brought relief, that for the first time she could exist as an individual without constant mirroring or dominance. In the years following Jennifer's death, June lived quietly, avoiding the public spotlight as much as possible. She spent time with her family in Wales, gradually reintegrating into a life that had always been denied her. While she remained shy and reserved, She no longer lived in silence. She read books, listened to music, and engaged with people around her. For the first time, she could begin to explore her own identity. Wallace continued to publish accounts of the twins' story, most notably in her book The Silent Twins, 1986, later updated, which drew heavily on their diaries and her long relationship with them. Through Wallace's work, June's survival and transformation became part of the public record. The story was no longer only about two mute sisters who turned to crime and ended up in Broadmoor. It became also about the resilience of one surviving twin, who, after years of silence, found her voice. June occasionally reflected on the strange circumstances of Jennifer's death. She acknowledged the medical cause, myocarditis, but also believed in the significance of the pact. To her, Jennifer had indeed given up her life so that she could be free. This belief shaped how she made sense of her survival. It was not merely a random tragedy, but part of the story they had written together, carried out to its inevitable conclusion. Over the years, interest in the Silent Twins resurfaced in documentaries, articles, and eventually films. June sometimes participated indirectly, though she remained private and guarded about her life. She expressed a desire not to be defined solely by her past, but also acknowledged that her and Jennifer's story had become larger than either of them. For June, life after Jennifer was both a release and a burden. Freed from the oppressive dependence that had dominated her life, she was finally able to speak and live independently. Yet she carried with her the memory of their pact, the weight of her sister's sacrifice, and the knowledge that her survival had come at the highest cost. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, June lived quietly in West Wales. She maintained her privacy, seldom seeking publicity, and focused on building a life that had once seemed impossible. Her story, one of tragedy, resilience, and the complicated bond of twinship, remained a subject of fascination for psychologists, writers, and filmmakers. But for June herself, it was simply the continuation of a life that, after Jennifer's death, she was finally able to claim as her own. The story of June and Jennifer Gibbons did not end with Jennifer's sudden death in 1993. In many ways, that moment marked the beginning of a legacy that would ripple outward across psychiatry, literature, media, and the cultural imagination. Their lives, defined by silence, mirrored existence, and the shocking pact of sacrifice, became a case study and a symbol, a reminder of the extremes of human connection and the failures of institutions to understand or respond adequately to it. In the field of psychiatry, the Gibbons twins case has been studied for decades as an example of selective mutism, psychogenic dependence, and pathological twinship. Their behavior challenged neat categories. They were not schizophrenic, nor developmentally impaired, nor incapable of communication. They demonstrated high intelligence and produced volumes of complex writing, yet they remained mute outside their private world. For psychiatrists, the case highlighted the limitations of diagnostic frameworks that rely on outward behavior while missing the inner richness revealed in their diaries. The decision to place them in Broadmoor for 11 years has since been criticized as excessive, a product of a system that conflated silence with dangerousness and left two vulnerable young women institutionalized among violent offenders. In literature and journalism, their story reached the world primarily through Marjorie Wallace, whose persistence and empathy opened a window into the twins' inner lives. Her book, The Silent Twins, remains the definitive account, weaving together the twins' own words with her observations to create a portrait of extraordinary intimacy and tragedy. The book has been translated into multiple languages and studied widely, not only by professionals but by general readers drawn to the uncanny and unsettling dimensions of the story. Through Wallace's work, the twins' own writing, filled with longing, violence, and imagination, found an audience they had never sought, but which gave them posthumous recognition as artists as well as subjects of psychiatric fascination. The media and arts further extended their legacy. Documentaries aired on British television in the 1990s and 2000s, examining the twins' lives and interviewing June after Jennifer's death. These films brought the story to new audiences, often focusing on the eerie details, the secret language, the mirrored movements, the pact, that gave the case its haunting character. In 2022, the feature film The Silent Twins, directed by Agnieszka Smoczynska and based on Wallace's book, premiered internationally. Starring Letitia Wright as June and Tamara Lawrence as Jennifer, the film dramatized their childhood, their descent into crime, and their Broadmoor years, blending realism with stylized sequences inspired by their own creative writing. The adaptation reintroduced their story to a global audience, emphasizing both the tragedy of their confinement and the depth of their inner worlds. For June, the legacy was more personal. Living quietly in Wales after her release, she sought a life beyond the gaze of media and researchers. Yet she also came to accept that she and Jennifer had become symbols, their story endlessly interpreted and retold. She gave occasional interviews in which she reflected on the past, acknowledging both the pain of her years in Broadmoor and the strange relief that followed Jennifer's death. "I'm free, and at last I can live," she once said, encapsulating the terrible truth of their pact, that her freedom was purchased through her sister's death. The cultural impact of the silent twins lies in their ability to unsettle boundaries. They were neither fully victims nor villains, neither mute nor communicative, neither entirely united nor separate. Their silence was not an absence of thought but an act of exclusion, a refusal to participate in a world that had rejected and ridiculed them. Their crimes were destructive but not murderous. Yet the punishment they received reflected society's fear of what could not be understood. Their pact was both horrifying and profoundly human, an attempt to resolve the unbearable paradox of love and suffocation, dependence and individuality. Jennifer's gravestone, inscribed with the words, "We once were two, we two made one. We no more two, through life be one. Rest in peace," captures the essence of their bond. They were always one entity as much as two individuals, and in death, their story has remained inseparable. Today, the silent twins are remembered not only as a psychiatric case but as a story of resilience, tragedy, and the complexities of identity. Their diaries, still preserved, testify to their creative powers and their acute awareness of their plight. Psychologists cite them as an example of how twinship can shape identity to extraordinary degrees. Writers and artists continue to revisit their story, drawn to its strangeness and its humanity. For June, survival meant carrying forward both her own life and the memory of her sister. For the world, the Gibbons twins remain an enduring mystery. Two girls who chose silence, who bound themselves together in ways few could comprehend, and who resolved their shared struggle through a pact that ended in death and liberation. Their legacy endures as a reminder of the limits of understanding, the power of human bonds, and the thin line between connection and destruction. The story of the silent twins is one of tragedy, mystery, and resilience, a reminder of how powerful and how destructive human bonds can be. June and Jennifer Gibbons will forever remain a case that challenges what we think we know about identity, freedom, and love. If you found this journey through their lives as fascinating and haunting as I did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and join me here on Eternal Obsidian for more stories that dive into the hidden, the eerie, and the unforgettable. Until next time, stay curious and stay in the shadows with us.